Hi, we are on week 3 and we're going to go ahead and start module 2, physical and cognitive development. So let's go ahead and take a look at our objectives. In this module, we are working to provide participants with information on child development in the area of physical development, including physical growth and maturation, sensation and perception, gross motor development and fine motor development, and then we're also looking to provide information on child development in the area of cognitive development, including executive functioning, oral language and communication, and cognitive problem solving. We are going to talk about physical development this week, and then we will move into cognitive development next week. So first, it's important to define some key terms. So last week we already defined maturation, and really those are determined largely by biology, and they're the timing and rates of change in how the body functions. It's also important that we know growth, and that's changes in the body in terms of amounts, and these are mostly observable things like size, weight, length, head circumference, etc. It also covers the physical changes to the internal organs and tissues and their work in relation to maturation. So growth is actually very rapid during the first 3 years of life, and we see that when we see an infant move into toddlerhood and how much change goes on during that time. We talked about development last week, but that is a key term that also needs to define, and that's the change in growth that occurs in children. So development actually accompanies growth and maturation. All three are interdependent, and all three take turns influencing each other. So we're going to look at development in growth and maturation in terms of physical development, and we are going to start with a broad overview, and then we're going to move into infancy, and then toddlers, and then preschool. So when we're looking at development, we know that change is generally very rapid the first 2 years of life. However, some of those changes are rapid, others are a little more gradual. It's always important to note that children are going to follow their own timetables for development. But we do know that more change occurs in the first 3 years of life than at any other time in life. Because during this time, infants are developing physically, cognitively, and socially and emotionally. Most of the first year of life for an infant is actually spent learning to coordinate motor skills, and that's essentially sensor motor development, which we will talk about in here. A big part of physical development for infants is actually understanding reflexes. So reflexes are actually automatic body responses to stimuli controlled by the lower brain centers that govern involuntary processes in us, even as adults. But at birth, infants' abilities are actually limited by their reflexes. However, they need some of those reflexes to survive, and we'll talk about what that looks like. Because reflexes are actually pre-wired, and they help to build and strengthen the neural pathways, those same neural pathways that children will continue to develop through the process of brain wiring. Some of these reflexes are going to appear at birth and then disappear. Others are going to stay with you your whole life. So blinking is an example of a reflex that stays with you. However, there are a lot of reflexes that still exist in the 6 to 8 weeks mark for infants, and so it's really important that caregivers continue to help foster those neural pathways. So here's a list of the reflexes. They are generally split up into 2 categories, survival or primitive, and these are the ones that impact us in infancy. So survival are necessary for life and include breathing, sucking, and swallowing. And they have to have the sucking and swallowing piece. Obviously, they have to have breathing, but the sucking and swallowing piece are key for eating. The primitive reflexes that you were born with that eventually disappear are Moro, which is the startle reflex, which I'm sure some of you guys have seen, and that's kind of that arms and legs fling outward and head extends, and we do that even still as adults sometimes. The palmar grasp, so that's when you stroke an infant's palm, and the hand is going to close tightly, usually around whatever has stroked it, so your finger. Babinski is when you stroke an infant's foot, and the toes fan out and curl. And then there's the stepping or the walking reflex, which is actually an interesting one, where if you hold the child and they put their feet on the ground, a very young infant, they will actually move their feet like they are walking. When looking at development in infancy in terms of physical development, you have to understand motor developmental milestones, which is motor sequence, which we're going to talk about in a second. But there's a basic orderly uniform pattern, and they occur in a predictable order, and it's just all movement building upon other movement. So here's motor sequence here, and this should feel comfortable to everybody too, especially those of us who have been around infants. But essentially, an infant is going to be able to lift their head and move it from side to side before rolling. They're going to be able to roll before they can sit upright, and they're going to be able to sit upright before they crawl, and they're going to crawl before they walk. Now, this is a really easy time to see how each child develops in their own timetable. So we all know infants that maybe never rolled over, or ones that never sat up right, or ones that never crawled before they started walking. So just note that everybody is going to develop in their own timetable, but there is a basic orderly uniform pattern that should be expected. It's also really important to note that in order for motor sequence to exist, we need to be putting infants in the least restrictive environment. So the least restrictive environment is an environment that is free of things that will restrict them. So an example of a restrictive equipment would be a stroller, a high chair, those bouncy seats. And the reason for that is when they're strapped in like that, they can't do what? They can't do physical movement. So I'm not saying that you can't ever use those. I'm just saying that we want to make sure that children are out and have ample opportunity to move about for most of their day. So I'm going to give you a broad look at fine and gross motor or large motor before we move into what that looks like for infants, toddlers, and preschoolers. But fine motor is the control of small muscles, and they include things like cutting, writing, and drawing. Gross motor or large motor is control of large muscles, and that includes things like running, jumping, hopping, skipping, riding a bike, all that great grand stuff. So make sure that you make a note of the difference and that you really understand what fine motor is and what large motor is as we move through the next slides. So we've talked a lot about infancy already and the importance of motor sequence. When we transition into toddlerhood, there's some things that are going on during this time. Really, toddlers are working on controlling their muscles at will, balancing, and coordination. But we know that in order for this to happen, they need lots of time and lots of repeated experiences to enhance both fine motor and gross motor. Their center of gravity is actually going to begin to shift downward, which this makes coordination improve in toddlerhood. But really, it's all about movement. Children just need to move. And it's kind of the same in infancy, and you'll notice that it's going to be the same in preschool. So in the preschool years, the growth and maturation process is going to slow down a little bit. And growth that does occur is going to be mostly in legs and trunk. And all children are going to develop a less toddler-like trunk, and they're going to become less top-heavy, which is going to help with coordination and balance too. There's some information here on average weight and height gains I'm not going to go into, but essentially a preschooler physically looks like they're no longer an infant. They start to look like children during the preschool years. We also know that preschoolers are extremely physical. They need to run, jump, move, and this is because learning for them is actually transmitted through their large muscles. So they learn from their hand to their head. So because of this, preschool children should actually spend about a quarter of their day in physical activity, because children learn best when they are actively involved in their learning. So I just want to touch on this briefly, but because of the fact that physical development is so tied to cognitive development, and we'll talk about that too over the next couple of weeks, paper and pencil activities are far less useful activities for teaching young children. I'm not saying don't give children paper and pencil to practice fine motor development. I am saying there should be not a focus on using worksheets to teach children key concepts and skills, because what children really need is a combination of free play and planned physical activities for both fine and gross motor that include both indoor and outdoor during this time. And they need to be meaningful, they need to be relevant, and they need to include the actual real objects that children can explore. So preschoolers are going to make really good gains in fine motor development and gross motor development, but they're not going to reach any sort of sophisticated manual dexterity during the preschool years. Really, they just need continued time and experience to make sure that they're getting what they need to develop physically, because that physical development is going to provoke cognitive development. However, you may be able to note any physical delays during this time because they're going to become more apparent. We're going to switch gears slightly and talk about perceptual development and spatial awareness, But essentially, perceptual development is how infants and toddlers process sensory information through experiences and interactions with objects and people in their environment. This is also called sensory motor integration, and really all it's saying is that infants and toddlers and even preschoolers learn through their 5 senses. So they're using their senses to process information, which is another reason why having hands on real objects in the classroom is extremely important for learning. We also know that infants are born ready to make sense of the world around them, and they're using their bodies to explore the world through sensory integration. And this is really essential for goal-directed behavior, and it's also a time for caregivers and parents to take note of children who may be overloaded by sights and sounds. In preschool, perceptual development is still occurring, but it really starts to become dependent on the brain and central nervous system. Preschoolers are still learning through their senses, so that's sight, touch, smell, taste, and hearing. And not all of these senses are extremely well developed. All of these senses are well developed, but cognitive processes that accompany them are less than complete. And that's why it's still really important that teachers understand that this is how children are going to learn information. Here's some interesting facts about perceptual development. Preschoolers have a more acute sense of taste than adults, which might explain why they don't like things like vegetables. They are actually very farsighted, and they're still developing binocular vision, so that's the ability to use both eyes together to focus on an object. However, hearing is pretty well developed, but during this time, perceptual development is really all about strengthening that mind-body connections. So spatial awareness is actually the ability to be aware of oneself in space, and this involves perceptual development and motor systems working together. The one way that you can develop this is through sensory motor play. So an example of that is rolling a ball or pulling a toy. You can promote spatial awareness through language, actually. So that's by using things like up, down, over, under, because really you're having those conversations with children anyways. It's also developed through repeated experiences, so they need to play with objects, they need to explore the environment with objects, and they need to recognize how their body works in space with objects. Spatial awareness is actually important for later academic development because it's the foundation for being able to structure and organize written work, and is preparing the brain to solve more complex math problems. So this week you do have a discussion question due. It's Module 2, discussion question 1, and a resource collection item due on a lesson plan on physical development, so fine or gross motor. It's going to be number 4 or 5, which I'll explain to you in the next video. I will provide an example of how to fill out the resource collection item, and if you have any questions, go ahead and reach out. Thanks, guys.